Hello, hello. I'm so glad to be here with everybody and to share a bit of my story. So, my story starts about 9 years ago. My divorce was final. It even started a little bit before that. Several months before that, my husband said that he wanted a divorce, and that wasn't something that I wanted to do. And it kind of shattered my world for a little while. And I had to refigure out who I was and what I was and what all was happening with that. I'd been married for 10 years and I'd lost myself in the marriage. I'd lost who I was in my essence. I was a wife, I was a stepmom, and that I was a teacher, I was a classroom teacher. I still am. And so that was all my identity was wrapped up in those things. And then I slowly began to rediscover myself in those months after the divorce. And kind of right in the middle of that, my mom started having issues with her vision and her memory. She forgot to put an ingredient in a cupcake recipe that she made pretty regularly. She lost her way 5 minutes from the house, going from Walmart to pick up a prescription and coming back home. A place that she had traveled to so many times, and she couldn't remember how to get back to the house. And then she also was at a church event with a bunch of women and couldn't find her way from the restroom back to the meeting place. And so a friend encouraged her to go get some tests done, to check in with her doctor to see what was really going on there. And the doctor talked to my mom, sent her to the hospital that day for an MRI. That was a Monday or a Tuesday, and she was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And so they needed to do surgery right away. So that was a Monday. I think that was a Monday. And then that Thursday, that same week, she was being wheeled in for surgery. It took forever for the surgery. People came and left the waiting room as the hours ticked by. The woman who ran the desk even left. And then we were the last ones there. And the doctor came out and said they found what's called a glioblastoma multiforme. It's a type of brain tumor where the fingers of the tumor reach into the brain tissue. And so when they resect that, they resect most of it, but they're not able to get all of it because of those fingers in the tissue. It's a very fast-growing type of tumor. So she went into recovery. Once she was recovered from the surgery, she went to radiation, which even the doctors will tell you, like traditional treatments, radiation, chemotherapy don't really do much for the tumor. But she wanted to try it anyway. So she did radiation. And on her last radiation appointment, my brother had scheduled friends to take her. And I was like, hey, look, I'm on break. I was on Christmas vacation. I said, I'll take mom and dad. My dad had been diagnosed with Parkinson's a few years prior to this. And so mom was his caregiver. So now we kind of begin a little bit taking care of dad, but not as much, not just yet, a little more, a little later. So we went to the treatment, the last treatment. She got to ring the bell and do all of the things. And the doctor kind of talked about how she was doing. And then they sent us on our way to check back in with the oncologist later. Well, in the middle of all of this, like I said, I was on break. My brother had gotten kind of frustrated with caring for mom and dad. He was living at the house full time with two older brothers. And the oldest brother said he needed a break. So I was like, look, the middle brother, he's out of town for a week. Why don't you go stay at his house? I'll stay with mom and dad for 5 days and I'll take care of things here. While I was there, discovered that the mail hadn't been sorted. The bills weren't being paid other than the utilities and credit cards. I had taken those over after my mom's surgery. And so I started taking over sorting the mail. It was kind of funny. We realized mom wasn't looking at the mail. And so the process was dad got the mail, handed it all to mom. Mom went through the mail and then handed to dad what dad needed to take care of or what he might be interested in, magazines, things that he got. And that wasn't happening. So the mail was just piling up. Dad didn't think to take any of that over. I had been added to their checking account at that time. So at that time, I'm working full time. I'm still trying to figure myself out. I hadn't been divorced for very long, not even a year yet. And we began taking care of our parents. And because I'm the girl and I'm the educator, I kind of see things in a different way. So as I saw things needing to be done, I would pick them up and do them. I didn't delegate very well. Looking back, I might have delegated a little bit better because I ended up taking on everything. It just felt easier that way at the time. So like I said, my mom had been my dad's caregiver, and that he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's, and we're caring for both of them. Like I said, my oldest brother lived in the house, and he didn't talk about it. He didn't say much until he got fed up and frustrated, and then it's, I can't do this anymore. I need help. So that week when I was on break and I was at the house with mom, with mom and dad, she ended up in the hospital. It was a week or two after her last radiation appointment. And this began rounds of some sort of treatment, mom going into the hospital, dad falling and breaking something. The first time it was ribs, several ribs. He wrapped himself around a kitchen chair, and then rehabilitation, and then home. And this began several rounds of that. My dad refused to use his walker because he was as stubborn as the day is long. And so in those moments when because of the Parkinson's shuffle and just the way he walked, he would often end up falling. He broke I think he broke almost every rib at one point or another. He broke a clavicle one time. I can't remember what. I feel like he broke something else, but I can't remember what it was. He did tear a tendon. He tore a tendon one time, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. So they both ended up in rehab together. We had been in the hospital at the same time. Mom was on one floor, dad is on another. We're bouncing back and forth between the two. When dad was moved to rehabilitation, he was unresponsive. And the next morning they called me and they sent him back to the hospital. He was almost in liver failure, which is code for organs are starting to shut down and someone is dying. Again, the hours ticked by. I called my brothers. They came when they were able. My dad did survive. He had a fever for several days after. And when he recovered, he went into this time of confusion. He thought he was at work and doing jobs for the hospital. That's why we were going there. And he had these dreams. We think with the high fever, he had all these dreams, and they were kind of enmeshed with what was actually real or had been real in the past. And so his veil between reality and dream world was very thin. And so it took him several months, almost a year, before he kind of came out of that. My brothers and I were, of course, primary caregivers. Most of the decisions had been placed on my shoulders. And then as things would come up, the three of us would talk about it. And we would also confer with mom and dad and make sure that those things were okay. Specifically dad. Mom, because of the brain tumor, she didn't have that mental capacity to handle discussions of some of these things. Her long-term memory was fine. She knew who I was to the day she passed away. Her long-term memory, however, was not very good. We would have the same conversation multiple times. I did all of the coordinating of all of the appointments, of the mail, of the therapist, of all of the things. My dad did recover, but not fully. We found that he would have some sort of an accident, something would happen, and he would fall back, and then he would never get back up to that level that he'd been at. He had kind of a new baseline. So previous baseline gone, new baseline. And then, and that would kind of continue. So he would recover and then fall back, and recover and then fall back. He finally ended up in the rehab that mom did. And they, this is one of those crazy times. They would argue so much that the nursing staff said, hey, your parents cannot be in a room together unless you or your brothers are present, unless we have a family member here. Because they would argue so much, because dad was confused from his fever and mom was confused from his brain tumor. And it just wasn't a very good time. And then we finally, this rehabilitation facility, we went round and round with them. I went round and round with them. I was a teacher. I'm an educator. I've been in education for 24 years. And I would tell my teacher friends, I'm like, I'm that parent, only with my parents and their care. But I identified myself as that parent that kind of hovered maybe a little too much and was on top of things and wanted to make sure that everything was being taken care of the way it needed to be taken care of. But my mom basically had a traumatic brain injury and she needed more regimen and more schedule. But they wouldn't do that. They would be like, well, we'll write in her notebook that we had therapy at this time, but we're not going to schedule it. And that was really, really frustrating to me. And then they didn't have any sort of, this is what we're working for, and this is when we'll be discharged kind of process. And so at one point we just got fed up and frustrated and ended up pulling them and sending them back home. So during this time, my brother that lived there, he would stay during the week, and then my other brother and I would alternate weekends. And then we had caregivers that would come in kind of to bridge the gaps between when we would leave and my other brother would get there. And it was during this time we had therapists coming to the house. And I remember we had a social worker came and she was talking about going back to just being the kids instead of constantly being the caregivers. And I remember thinking that is what I wanted. And that really resonated with me. So we ended up moving them into a care facility. Mom ended up in the nursing and dad ended up in assisted living. My mom wasn't there too many months. She did try and convince my brothers to take her home at first, but then she kind of got used to it. The staff there was absolutely, every place we went, the staff was amazing. The nursing staff are incredible. And so my mom ended up in the nursing care because she needed so much extra help. And it wasn't too long. I think she went in there in May, and on July 10th, which was 9 months to the day after her surgery, she passed away. And I will never forget that day. That was one of the hardest days of my life. I got a phone call really early in the morning, or not really early, in the late morning. I had just finished my workout and they said, today is the day. So I called everybody and we sat vigil bedside, kind of alternating and taking turns. And she finally passed away at around 9:30 in the evening with us sitting vigil around her all day. At one point that day, she said my name. So I know that she knew who I was to the day that she passed. And then, we had mom's funeral, and then we're thrust into continuing to care for my dad. He had fallen in February and had a tendon that kind of disconnected from his arm, and an orthopedic surgeon gone in and repaired that with a staple, but he had constant infection and had to be on high-dose IV antibiotics for a long period of time. The facility that he lived at, he wasn't allowed to have caregivers come into, because of the way it was structured, he wasn't allowed to have people come into his assisted living apartment. So he had to live in the rehabilitation facility, and he was kind of back and forth there. We went to multiple doctors and multiple specialists, and nobody could really figure out what was going on and why the infection wasn't going away. So finally, after 3 or 4 months of this, the surgeon decided to go back in and trace the infection back and see what was going on there. And so they traced the infection back to the staple. And once he removed the staple, fortunately, the tendon, bodies are amazing. The tendon had reattached, and he healed. And we ended up moving his facility before he passed away. I found a place that if he had therapies, that the therapist could come into him and that he didn't have to constantly be moving locations. It was a lot smaller, and the facility was much better suited to his needs. I'll never forget also the day he passed away. I got a call at 5 o'clock on a Monday morning. And as I said, I'm a teacher. And if I'm going to miss, I have to have lesson plans and things ready for my students to do. And the sweet nurse, we're on the phone, and she says, I need you to come in. I'm like, it's Monday morning, it's 5 a.m. I have class, I've got to teach today. Like, are we talking, like, what are we talking about here? Are we talking, I need to take a half day, or are we talking, I need to take a full day? And she and I went round and around several times until finally this sweet lady, who did not want to tell me over the phone that my father had passed away, told me that my dad had passed away. So I called off for the full day, contacted my brothers on my way to the facility. And then we started the business of taking care of the deceased. My father had died 2 years after my mom. So my mom died in July. My dad died 2 years later in September. And so dividing up the things, selling the properties, settling the estate, all that took a little over a year after my father passed away. But little did we know that a short year later, my oldest brother was going to die as well. And so in a 6-year time span, my mom passed away. 2 years later, my father passed away. And 2 years later, my oldest brother passed away. So now in my immediate family, all that's left is me and my older brother. So then we began the business of taking care of my older brother's estate as well, and all of his things, and selling stuff off. And that took around 2 years to get all of that done. My body, by the time this all ended, my body was in complete dysregulation. I had started, I worked out when my mom was sick. I had started doing CrossFit and found that that was 1 hour out of my day where I found some sanity, where I didn't have to think about what was going on with my parents. My phone stayed on all night because I never knew when I was going to get a phone call. And I often would get the 2, 3, 4, 5 a.m. phone calls about something going on with one of my parents. And after I did CrossFit for a little while, I actually powerlifted for a couple of years. And that wasn't meeting my needs anymore either. I was going to the gym, and I'd get there. There were a couple guys lifting really heavy, and they would take up all of the spaces to lift. And I never knew where they were in their workout. And so I didn't know how long I was going to have to wait for them to be done. And so I would walk to the top of the stairs, see that they were there, and turn around and leave because it wasn't worth my time. It took so much for me to get there. And so a friend of mine suggested that I come back to yoga. Well, I had started yoga when I was a college student. It was a PE credit. And my school started offering yoga classes through this absolutely lovely teacher. And I signed up for it and started going to the studio and really just began to feel better, began to get back in touch with myself, with my body. And this particular teacher encouraged me to go through a yoga teacher training. And I was going to do hers, but that fell through. She moved the date from spring to fall, and fall just didn't work for my schedule. And so I found somebody else and signed up for their yoga teacher training. So this was in the late winter of 2020. So around February 2020, I signed up for this yoga teacher training in Costa Rica in person. And I wanted to write social emotional curriculum for my students. I was seeing such a rise in students with anxiety and depression, and I wanted to make an impact in that and help them, give them tools, give them things to help them with their bodies because of what I had learned with mine. And so we all know what happened in March of 2020. The yoga teacher training didn't happen. And the teacher ended up flipping her model and going to a virtual yoga teacher training. And so I immediately signed up and went for that. So that was my 200 hour. And then it connected with me in such a powerful way. And I had a conversation with her and decided to do my 300 as well. And then she offered a yin certificate, and then she offered a children's certificate. And now I'm actually helping teaching the exceptional learner portion of this year's children's yoga teacher training, which is really cool. So I started my business in September of 2020. I started Tulsi Rose Yoga, and I started as a way to connect with people who maybe felt that there was something in yoga for them, but were nervous about going to a traditional yoga studio. And so I created kind of a one-on-one model where I would work with people independently, and I do still do that. And also work with kids. So I have a teenager who is 14. Actually, he just turned 15. And he is high functioning on the autism spectrum. So I work with him to help connect with his body and help regulate his system. And he's had some physical issues as well. And yoga has not only helped with the physical aspect, but also the mental and emotional aspect. And I know his mom, when we first started and talked, didn't expect that at all. And so I started working with him. And then I had some other private clients that I worked with. I worked with a woman who was pregnant. She had some really painful sciatic issues because the baby, within one session, the pain was tolerable. Within 2 sessions, the pain was gone. We did lots of poses that specifically targeted, strengthened, and stretched those particular areas of the body in order to help, and then working the areas around that in order to help strengthen and support that part of the body. And in in January of this year, one of my best friends came to me and she said, "Paige, you need to teach grief yoga." And I went, "What? No, I don't need to do that," was my initial response. And as I've learned about myself over the years doing all of this work, I've learned that initial no response is something that I need to dive into. And so I dove. And what I found was that no wasn't really a no, it was actually a yes. And that I really did need to teach grief yoga. And so I have taken everything that I learned about the loss of my parents and my brother and how to re-regulate my nervous system and how to manage and be with my grief. And I share that with other people. So now I teach grief yoga containers. We do 6-week at a time containers, and each container has a different theme. And we talk about grief and what it's like to grieve and how grief feels in our body and where we might store it if we don't actually feel the grief, all of the feelings of grief, all of the happiness, the sadness. Yes, there is happiness associated with grief. I'm not completely crazy. The anger, the frustration. And so we take all of that and we look at it and we feel it within ourselves, and we use the physical movement of yoga to bring it to the surface. And we use the breath and meditation to structure it and contain it and process it and allow it to move through our bodies. And we learn who we are in our grief now that this life-altering thing has happened in our world. So what it's like now for us and how to move forward and not just live and go through the motions, but to thrive. I did a live the other day with one of my clients, and she's such a beautiful soul. She's been with me from the beginning. And she had never practiced yoga before she started with me. A lot of the people who come to my classes have never practiced yoga before. And she talked about her space. She has a little yoga space in her house now. And she does a little something on the mat every single day because it's made such a powerful impact in her life, in her world, and how she sees and processes and utilizes things. And she had lots of grief cakes as well. And so she just beautifully talked about how it impacted her life and how now she has a yoga practice and now she has come back to herself, and how the power of yoga within that. And I want to talk a little bit about dysregulation for a minute. So the grief cakes, I'll tell you where the grief cakes comes from. So a couple of months before my father passed away, a friend of mine was having a 30th birthday party, and his significant other asked me to make cupcakes for the birthday event surprise party that she was throwing for him. And so I did, or at least I tried to. And I was in such a state that I ruined 3 batches of 3 dozen cupcakes trying to make these cupcakes for my friend. And I feel like they represent the grief in my life because they're just this mess, and there were multiples. And so grief cakes, it's this large bit of multiple events. But the magic comes when you lean into the grief. The magic comes when you lean into what's there for you in the midst of the trouble, in the middle of the, oh my gosh, I can't believe this moments. Because what's on the other side is where the magic really lies. And sometimes we go through different paths and different roads to get to that point. And to get there, just keep pushing and keep leaning in to the uncomfortable, because I promise you, the magic is truly on the other side.